Abbott, and today I wanted to take a closer look at the Laowa 12mm f2.8 0D lens. When it comes to both its overall build and how it's been to use it in the field the last 3 weeks or so, and then also I thought we would take a look at kind of the main claim from the Laowa when it comes to whether or not it actually has zero distortion. We'll examine whether or not that plays out in the real world. So first of all, let me just comment on the lens, its build itself. I did a bit of that in my first look video, but now that I've kind of examined it more thoroughly, I do want to comment that this is really, it's the nicest lens that I have used, designed like this, a modern lens that's not named Zeiss before. It feels like a Zeiss lens in the hand. It's got that similar density, all metal construction, and it feels very much like a Zeiss. It's actually a fairly diminutive lens. It's not very big. It's less than 3 inches around, 2.94 inches, or right at about 75 millimeters in circumference at its widest, and it's only 3.26 inches long, and so that's 82, right under 83 millimeters. And so it's actually a very compact lens, which is great for having such an incredibly wide focal length. When you consider a lens like Canon's new 11 to 24 millimeter f4 zoom, it's actually a huge lens. And so having such a wide focal length in such a small package, I think is quite an attractive option for bringing it along. I really like the form factor of this lens. Also, it's interesting to note that while it has a curved front element, and by the way, while this lens doesn't necessarily claim to be weather sealed, I do want to comment on that, in that Laowa has, of course, you know, Laowa, the name means old frog, and so they've kind of themed off of the frog thing, and so they have what's called frog eye coating on the front element of this that is supposed to repel dust and moisture, and so I think it's kind of their version maybe of like a fluorine type coating that has a similar impact. And so the positive things is that while there isn't a rear gasket here, number one, if there is some protective coatings on the front, when you focus on the lens, there is nothing that moves externally at all. And so at the front element, there's no way for dust to get into the lens. And then at the back, while there is some very minor movement, it's about it's not quite a centimeter of movement overall, I would estimate about 1/4 of an inch if you think in terms of standard. But at no point does the rear travel move in such a way to where I can see inside the lens. And so it actually all stays very tightly sealed here, and it's very finely engineered here at the back and tooled. It kind of reminds me of the new Canon 35mm f1.4L Mark II. And it's actually one of the rear construction of this lens, and where the rear element is actually one of the nicest that I've seen from any lens manufacturer. And so bottom line is that I don't see a lot of areas for dust and moisture to actually get into this lens, and even if it does, having no internal electronics, no circuit boards, means that there is not really a whole lot to be impacted internally unless you've seriously flooded it in such a way to where there's a lot of moisture inside. And so that is a positive to me. Beyond that, you can go from f2.8 to f11, or f22, I should say, sorry, in the Apter ring. But one thing I will note that is a bit of a limitation as compared to kind of an electronically controlled aperture iris, is that with most lenses on Canon bodies, you can choose 1/3 stop increments. And so, for example, you could go from f2.8, to f3.2, f3.5, before you get to f4. Here, you have one jump from f2.8 to f4. And so it's just full stops here. And the only place I can feel an extra indent is between f16 and f22. And but anyway, at the same time, the Aptering is very smooth and precise, very nicely defined clicks or detents at each one of the aperture stops. And so the fact that it does move so well in that sense, it means that you would have no problem controlling this by feel. The other thing I want to note is that, of course, with a manual aperture ring, you can very easily see the aperture blade stopping down. And so in this case, there are 7 aperture blades, but it's stopped down. It continues all the way through f22 to have one of the roundest aperture openings that I have ever seen. It's actually really impressive how well it retains the aperture kind of circular quality as it stops down. So that is obviously a plus there as well. The other thing that I wanted to note about the curved front element is that while this lens hood, metal lens hood, is detachable, it's a fairly shallow petal-shaped hood, and so it can be reversed, which helps for storage. But the plus here is that there's actually an integrated little lip on either side that helps to make sure that even without this lens hood on, that if you come in contact with something solid, that these are going to hit first as opposed to that glass front element. So I think a sound design there. The actual focus ring is very nicely damped overall. Again, it feels like a classic Zeiss in that it's very finely ribbed and a metal ribbing there, and it moves very much like a Zeiss lens, very precise, very smooth, good damping weight on it, and so I like that overall. I estimate about 170 degrees of focus throw, and so physically this is a beautifully made lens, and really the only thing that I would change about it is having some kind of electronic communication to the actual lens body. It would help with metering a bit. It would also help in dealing with things like communicating the EXIF data, and so it makes it just easier for sorting for those of us that shoot a lot of photos with a wide variety of gear. But overall, it's a beautifully made lens. Now, while the lens is very compact in length and size, because it is such a high grade of metal and glass construction, it is, it's reasonably heavy, 1.34 pounds or 609 grams. And so, kind of a middle weight, but its size is on the smaller side of medium. So overall, a very nice package here that is surprisingly fantastic. There's nothing that feels budget about this lens at all. And so I think Laowa is trying to up their game in terms of the 2 lenses that I reviewed have actually been very, very nicely constructed. And so just note that fully manual everything, and so if you're not comfortable with that, it is a challenge. But at the same time, while there's 170 degrees of focus throw here, almost all of that is getting you to about 3 feet or 1 meter. And beyond that, it's actually quite a small focus play. I would estimate that only about 25% of that focus play is beyond that point. So really the only time you have to be super conscious about focus is if you're wanting to focus on something quite close. And this lens can focus down very closely, down to just basically half a foot, or a little over a half foot, and so that's close enough that when you consider that starts from the sensor, that you're able to get within just a little bit of your subject. And so there certainly is some focus play throughout that, but if you're looking to just have everything in focus, you really don't have to think about focus very much. In that, even at f2.8, the widest aperture, if you focus at a distance of about 6 feet, it means that everything from 2.9 feet in front of you to infinity will be in focus. So I found that out using it in the field, it's not very hard to have things in focus. In fact, unless you're wanting to focus on something close to you, you just set focus and you can forget about focus for the rest of the day. And so it's not hard to use in that sense at all. Let's take a look at one aspect of that image quality, and that is that distortion. Is this really a zero distortion lens? And so they claim to have zero traditional barrel distortion. So let's examine that claim. First, let's just take a look at two of the chief competitors here. And we'll look at We have the new Canon 16-35 f2.8L Mark III here on the left, and we have the Tamron 15-30 VC on the right. And both of these I would consider somewhat natural competitors. And so most we want to look at kind of the bulge in this area here. Obviously there's going to be some barrel distortion on both of these lenses, and so you can see that there's somewhat of a curvature in this section. Also, this will give us a comparative look at width, how wide you can go. So this being the widest that the Canon can go, 16mm, and so you can see here this is set up on a tripod. We're seeing just the beginning of this arch here, while on the Tamron, of course, you can start to see more of that. It goes wider all around here. But things get really interesting when we take a look at the Laowa here, and I'm just going to compare it to the Tamron since that's the wider angle of view here anyway. So now the Laowa is on the left here, and so you can see there is a much wider angle of view available here. Details we're not even seeing, the doors here on this side, the pumpkin that's over here. But kind of more importantly, as we look at all of these lines, we see that on the brick wall, we see that there is really great straightness here on this, and a nice straight line here in the corner. If we look here along this frame of this door, we can see that the line is nice, straight up and down. And so regarding the barrel distortion, I think that their claim is accurate. If I look at all of these lines that should be straight, they look straight to me, and that's across the frame. And so I'm not seeing any kind of traditional barrel distortion there. Now, I mentioned traditional barrel distortion because the reality is that you can make a choice regarding what you would call perspective distortion. Perspective distortion, like this here where you see the trees leaning, come because I have the camera tilted up to accommodate the height of the trees. And so in this case, it's the relationship between the sensor of the camera, or you can just say the camera, and the angle in which you're taking the picture. And so here, standing in the exact same spot, if I level out the camera, and so here obviously I'm losing the perspective looking up at the top of these trees, but I am obviously gaining nice straight lines. And so this is the difference here, in that there isn't actually any kind of barrel distortion that's affecting this. If we look at this image, it's not barrel distortion, it's what you call perspective distortion. And any wide angle lens is going to have perspective distortion. That's just the nature of physics here. But so you really have a lot of control. I guess my point is you have a lot of control over how you want an image to look, depending on how you level off the sensor. And of course, camera bodies that have leveling aids within them. I'm doing this review on the 5D Mark IV, and so I have a level show up there that has multi-level of leveling, and so it helps me to get a nice straight. And so in this case, you can see all of the lines of the trees are nice and straight as compared to here. And so if you want the leaning effect, then you just tilt the camera. And if you want it to be nice and straight, of course, you level things out. Now, the challenge there for when you're shooting architectural work is that it can be challenging to get everything square up to the camera itself. And so, for example, in this kind of situation where I needed to angle up to shoot higher, it would be very tough. The only way to get this perfectly straight with no perspective distortion would be to actually be up on a high level where I could have the camera level looking at these. This is why tilt shift lenses are so popular for those that do architectural photography, because it is the one way that you can change the tilt of the actual sensor, or the sensor of the camera in relation to the subject through the tilt mechanism of the lens itself. And so you don't have that alternative here. However, it is a huge advantage to start off with a very wide angle of view, and the wide angle of view allows you more kind of room to correct with, and then of course having no barrel distortion is a huge advantage as well. I did want to point out here just quickly that in this case, even this line, I deliberately kind of composed with this tree, which has a fairly straight line, right off towards the edge of the frame. And I wanted to demonstrate that if you hold the camera level here, that even something that's towards the edge, it doesn't have that stretching effect that often comes through distortion, but rather this line here stays nice and straight. So as you can see, Certainly, I believe that Laowa's claim of having zero barrel distortion is accurate. I think it's important, however, to make that distinction between having zero distortion in the sense of having no barrel distortion and the difference in having perspective distortion, which certainly a very wide focal length like 12 millimeters is going to have a lot of perspective distortion depending on how you use the lens itself in photography. And so I think that if you understand the limitations of that kind of claim, then I think that it puts it all into perspective for you. I would say that in real-world use, I certainly do see an advantage for the Laowa when it comes to the distortion aspect compared to other wide-angle lenses that I both own and or those that I have tested. And so it certainly makes a difference in how nice and straight I can render lines. And for me, it's less often about architecture and it's more often about a lot of trees and forest here living in Canada. And so for the kind of shooting that I do, I certainly can see a pretty huge advantage. For those of you that shoot architectural, the lack of barrel distortion is a big deal because it means that you're not going to have to contend with things like countertops, for example, or other walls that are going to be distorted. However, do recognize that if you're shooting in a very tight space, like say a bathroom, you're going to find that there is still some perspective distortion you're going to have to deal with. And so a big part of that is getting your camera up to the kind of optimum height for minimizing the perspective distortion. It's not really going to be a replacement for a tilt shift lens, obviously, and really you can't beat a tilt shift for architectural type photography. That being said, outside of a tilt shift lens, this really is a great option, part of which being the very wide focal length means that spaces are going to look bigger, but it also means that because it is so wide, it gives you more opportunity to actually do some perspective distortion correction without eliminating so much of the image that your image becomes useless. And so I think it is it's an interesting, intriguing option even for those of you that shoot for that. So we're going to continue in a future episode to look at more of the overall image quality claims from Laowa and just kind of break it down optically as that, as well as I'll follow up with my final verdict on it. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you haven't already, you can look down below to follow me on social media. You can see there a link to my ongoing image gallery of photos that I'm taking with the lens during my review. And of course, there's linkage there if you'd like to shop for one yourself. If you haven't already, please click that subscribe button. Thanks for watching. Have a good day.